Hi, my name is Petra van Dam and I'm going to tell you about our research project Coping with Drought, an environmental history of drinking water shortages and climate adaptation in the Netherlands 1550 to 1850. Here is our project team. I'm the coordinator, and then there is Milja van Tielhof, Daniel Moerman, Marja Heijen, Marit Steeman, and we still have a vacancy for a postdoc. Drought. Our project is about drought. A famous drought year was 1788, at the eve of the French Revolution. All weather stations measured a very low precipitation, and even the astronomical observatory in Paris measured very high air pressure for April. As a result, by the summer, the entire harvest was gone. Harvest failure leads to unrest at the countryside, and in this year in particular there was very widespread peasant uprisings. It went so far that peasants walked up to the tax archives in their departments and destroyed them because they couldn't pay the taxes anymore. Now, of course, drought is only one cause of the French Revolution. There is a whole historical context, a political, social, economic and cultural context we would have to consider to explain the French Revolution. We know that. But we can already see from comparing with other countries that, of course, drought was not the only cause, because in other countries where the same drought occurred, there was no French Revolution. For instance, in England, agriculture was large scale and commercial, whereas in France it was small scale and non-commercial. So agriculture in France had no reserves. The peasants were immediately lost when the harvest failed. This was different in England. This was also different in Holland, where agriculture was much more modern and had much more reserves. Also, if we compare over time, we can see that in France in previous years also severe droughts occurred. However, this did not lead to French revolutions. So in those years the other conditions for the French Revolution were of course not met. My sole reason for showing this slide is to make sure what I want to say about nature as a historical agent. We consider nature as having an important influence in history, but of course we do not explain history by nature or climate change or weather variations. It's just one of the causes. We derive our concepts from environmental history. Climate, or mostly weather, that is what we mostly study, and landscape are historical agents, but also drinking water and micro water infrastructures we could consider as historical agents, and they are not pure nature, of course. As soon as you turn water into drinking water, you maneuver with it, you may even pollute it, and micro water infrastructures like pumps and wells and canals, or rivers turned into canals, or lakes turned into water containers. They're all sort of hybrids between nature and culture. We also derive concepts from drought and disaster studies. That is to say, drought is one of the objects of disaster studies. Other objects may be volcanic eruptions or floods. Drought is defined as following. Meteorological drought means very little precipitation. Hydrological drought means low levels of the surface and groundwater. And agrarian drought means damage to food ecosystems, food plants, farm animals. However, such a drought or such a combination of droughts may only lead to a disaster if there is no sufficient societal response. So this is what we call the critical societal factor. A drought can only become a disaster, and then I say a nature-induced disaster because it starts with nature, but human response is important, Drought can only become a nature-induced disaster if political, social, economic and cultural adaptations are not sufficient. Many historians have worked in this area of disaster studies. To the left you see a scheme from the book Disasters in History by Van Bavel and others, and he shows a sort of cycle of response to the hazard at the top left, number 1, how a hazard turns into a disaster or not, and that depends on the institutional reaction. So he differentiates response and change. And in the other scheme to the right, published by Vista, you see a similar type of cycle where you see the danger sign here. This is where the natural hazard occurs, and then it turns to the left into this cycle of response of society, and that cycle determines to what extent this natural hazard becomes a real disaster with lots of damage. In between the phases that he discerns, he puts the L of learning, so there is learning in between the phases. That means that over time the social vulnerability may decrease because people develop all sorts of ways to cope or to prevent or to mitigate social disasters. But these L's of learning are very comparable to these institutional responses in the other scheme. Here's another type of scheme that helps us to think how a society can absorb changes, then it's here, and if changes become very big, disturbances from outside caused by natural disasters for instance, then it can adapt. However, if the changes and disturbances become too big, society may need to get into a transformation or a transition, as we say now in the 21st century. That means very large-scale changes, for instance in infrastructure, and very, very large investments. I think that in the early modern period for drinking water, society stayed within the first two cycles, absorption and adaptation. Here we have to take into account a critique by the historian Tim Soons and others that we should not conceptualize society as a whole. The society is not resilient, it's groups in society that are resilient or vulnerable. So we have to take into account the so-called social inequality or even environmental injustice, as it is sometimes called. Here is our research question. In the Netherlands, in what ways did the practices and norms and values regarding the provisioning and use of drinking water develop during the period 50-50, 80-50, and how did these contribute to societal resilience, to drought of course, under different environmental and social conditions? How did groups of people adapt to practices, norms and values? How was that dependent on environmental and societal conditions? And how did groups of people become more resilient to drought? We focus on comparing cities. Why is that? First of all, cities offer very interesting complex situations, socially complex but also complex in terms of nature. In cities we find very interesting social institutions that take care of water provisioning, like well communities in the eastern Netherlands or charitable organizations all over the Netherlands. In addition, in the water field there was a commercial sector. Those were the brewers, but also usually small drinking water enterprises. And last but not least, cities provide rich administrative sources, which are very helpful. The natural situation of the Netherlands is fascinating. We had, and we still have, many kinds of fresh water. Here I show a map with the three main types of water: surface water, groundwater and rainwater. Now look at the green parts of the Netherlands. This is where groundwater is the primary source. Then the blue parts and some colored parts around that are areas where surface water is the prime source or one of the big sources. And then there is one very special color, that's yellow. The yellow is quite an emergency color, I would say. 3 areas, Frisia, North Holland and Zeeland. Here rainwater is the only water available to the water consumer. Why is that? Because here both the groundwater and the surface water were often brackish, salty, because of infiltration of the salt water of the North Sea and the South Sea here in the middle. Now, this natural condition of drinking water in the Netherlands leads me to hypothesis number 1. I think resilience has much to do with flexibility. And here we see that a household that has access to various sources of drinking water around the house, like and well water and surface water, as we can read here, or and rainwater and surface water, or and well, rain and surface water, those houses were very flexible in times of drought. Surface water. Surface water is actually the most easy type of water to get. The access is simple, just jump down into the river, the lake or the canal and you have it. And for making this more easy, you can build little staircases. However, in cities the question is the water clean enough? Because in cities we have pollution from the population and from industry. So the cleanness of the water depends very much on the hygienic system and norms and values in the city. And to the right I have here a picture of the cleaning system of the city of The Hague. You see boats, wheelbarrows and several types of carts. This one transports ashes that has to be covered, otherwise it flows away and it shouldn't get wet. And this is more for street dirt and other types of organic dirt that may also come from the markets. So the city needed to be swept all the time, and all this rubbish needed to be carried off in boats, usually by water. So as to that, dirt and waste did not end up in the water. I said you can take the water out very easily without any troubles, but of course where the water is not so easily accessible, other technologies were developed, and this is a lifting technology that was often used by breweries. They lifted up water with a type of crane, and in some cases water companies use that too. So this horse may pull a little cart for a little water enterprise that gets its water here out of the river Vecht, as it is here in Utrecht. Groundwater was always very clean, but here the access was complex. You needed quite capital intensive installations, like first wells and later pumps. You needed to dig it. That was already quite an operation, could only be done by specialists, and then later it needed maintenance. So no wonder that in the eastern Netherlands well communities were developed for this maintenance. Another problem is, how deep can you dig? In times of drought, typically people would make deeper wells, but not all water layers are good. Some are even poisonous. So here is a limitation and a problem for research. The third type of water is the rainwater. Now, rainwater is free and it is clean, so what better can you have? However, how do you capture it and how do you store it? This needs capital investment. First of all, you need to capture it, for instance, on the roof, and lead it down in pipes to a cistern, which is either under the house, under the court, or in front of the house, under the street. Also, you could try to capture water from the street here, but then the water is already filthy. To the left, you see a cistern that was found very recently in the spring of 2021 under a one-family private house, and it is in very good shape, as you can see. So we were very pleased with this picture. Rainwater was not only caught and captured by private one-family houses, but of course also by very large buildings. Buildings like orphanages, old people houses, hospitals, prisons. Here's the example of the Amsterdam orphanage. The painting to the right depicts the 19th century, but the material layout you see certainly dates back to the 17th century. To the right you see a design of the cistern that's under this court, a very large, of dozens of meters of 3 big cisterns capturing the water from the roofs of this enormous building. This is the court of the girls. There was also a court for the boys that had also other water cisterns. And the access to this water goes through the pump that you see depicted here to the left, and that is still present. So a very beautiful picture we have here of this installation, which was obviously expensive to build and needed maintenance. So there was always an access to these cisterns where people could enter and clean them out or repair the walls. But apart from these private types of water harvesting from the roofs, in some cases cities began to collect water in public places. And we have here again an example of Amsterdam, because so far the literature is most elaborated for that. This square catches water, probably through the stones here around that are not sealed or anything. So the cistern is underneath, and in this little building is the pump, which is the access to the cistern, and here to the left is the access for maintenance. Here you see a contemporary representation. This is the square in front of the Western Church, where this access for maintenance is still present, and this type of cistern would receive its water from the church roof. Now I'd like to present our research projects. Project number 1 is on urban societies in the Western Netherlands, and in particular also on charitable institutions. We like to know which types of water these institutions used and for which purposes. What coping strategies did these institutions apply during times of scarcity? Do we see flexibility and adaptation, or do we see signs of stress and crisis like financial or mortality crisis? And then the social equality question: what differences existed in water provisioning between poor and well-funded orphanages? For case studies, this project concentrates on the province of North Holland, the cities there, in particular also the city of Amsterdam. Project 2 is on knowledge and perception of water quality. Here we want to know, how did people experience water? Was there a kind of hierarchy in water, like good water, better water, excellent water, bad water? How did medical and scientific insights develop about water? And in the household, at the level of daily life, how did recipe books, for instance, qualify water for different foodstuffs? Another type of question is, how did people think about water as a natural right? Did people have a sort of natural right to water? And what does it mean for public responsibility? Should the government guarantee that also poor people, for instance, would always get enough water? The sources for this project are very much in treatises, almanacs, and recipe books. The third project is on urban societies in the eastern Netherlands, the green area that I showed at the map, where the sandy soils contain sufficient groundwater, and yet other types of water provisioning existed too. Questions are: how did natural, social, political and economic factors influence the development of drinking water provisioning during imported drought years? What specific risk mitigating strategies were employed to prevent drought-induced water shortages? Think of rationing, water storage and looking for alternative resources. And how did these contribute to resilience to drought. The case studies for this project are the cities of Deventer, Zutphen, Groningen and the Bosch. In the fourth project, in the synthesis, at the end of the project we'll draw the big lines, and for the moment I have a simple hypothesis. In the period 1550-1850, Dutch society was highly resilient to drought and water shortage because in daily life the dominant traditional coping with drinking water was characterized by flexibility, both at the level of practices regarding micro water infrastructures and at the level of norms and values, and in times of threatening drought crisis, adaptation was thus relatively easy. However, for some groups this worked out better than for others. So I think resilience we should interpret as national and social flexibility, primarily access to various sources of drinking water per building helped very much to accommodate in times of drought, but of course practices, norms and values were very important too. Some people call these institutions because they determine the access to the drinking water and many other things. Thanks for watching this presentation. Now please consider joining us at our website. We will send you a short text connecting our project to current developments about every month, and of course also we publish our publications on this website. And finally, this project, Coping with Drought, is financed by the Dutch Organization of Scientific Research, NWO.